Okay. Quickly, for those of you, Christine Libran's on the panel, and she's our training director for our demography program, in case you ever have a student who has a question.
Great.
Okay, it looks like we're about ready to start. I want to welcome everyone today. We have a wonderful panel planned. I wanted to quickly introduce our leader today who will be moderating the panel. We have Dr. Amy Stover here. She's the Director of Climate Impacts Group and also the University Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I also wanted to quickly acknowledge Ann Bostrom, who is also instrumental in putting the group together today. So thank you both to Dr. Snover and to Dr. Bostrom. And with that, I'll just say, remember to put your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we will manage those at the end. And it would be helpful not to use the chat because it can get kind of tricky with having two things going on. And also, I will unmute you. So remember, you can ask your own question. And so say I have a question, that would be fine too. And so thank you again to Dr. Stover, and I'll let you take over from here.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ann Bostrom, for kicking us off to actually come together and have this conversation. And thanks everybody for joining us today. As Maria said, I run the Climate Impacts Group, which is at University of Washington. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and we do science and stakeholder engagement to support climate resilience across the Northwest. And one of the questions that people, increasingly have for us, a lot of local decision makers, has been, what do we need to think about for climate migration? And in particular, isn't everyone going to move here because it's not as bad as everywhere else in the country? And what should we be doing to prepare for it? So in 2016, we hosted a symposium that brought together actually some of the folks here, and so researchers in demography and society, actually folks from state offices that do population projections, and then a whole bunch of the local decision makers who are responsible for using population projections in their planning, to ask the question of like, what do we know? What don't we know? What should we be worried about? What should we be thinking about? And also to help those folks answer their constituents, because climate change migration had kind of become a gotcha question that they were asked at public meetings. Like, oh, so you're planning on our water resources system, but have you thought about climate change migration and all those people that are going to come in here, and don't you need more? So that was really an exciting and interesting time, and my first time to sort of dig more deeply into the research and thinking that goes on in this area. And I guess I should tell the answer. At the time, they decided that it was an important enough issue to keep an eye on, and yet there wasn't enough information or evidence to warrant changing the way projections were being made for our region. And so it was a promise to continue a conversation. So today isn't exactly a continuation of that conversation, but it's a continuation of a conversation in that vein. So, I was just talking a little bit about the really local implications of climate change migration. And in that symposium, we were only thinking about domestic changes. And, it's a much, much bigger issue when we think globally and internationally. There's much more sort of deep causes sort of causing, potentially uprooting folks, and then much more complex flows like within and between nations. So I think that's what we're going to hear a little bit more about tonight. It's not tonight yet, today, from a bunch of different perspectives. So we've got 3 awesome panelists. They're each going to give us 10 minutes of their thoughts and deep thinking, and then we will have time for Q&A and a discussion. So we're going to begin with Dr. Sarah Curran, who is, as I think most everybody on here knows, but you never know with Zoom, the director of the University of Washington Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. She looks at population dynamics and migration, environment, development, and gender. She's also the president of the Association of Population Centers. And Sarah is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks so much to Anne for organizing this. And I feel awkward being in the hot seat of what I'm usually on the back end of these events. So happy to share a little bit about our research. And I remember with great deal of interest that event of in Portland, thinking about the Northwest. So I'm happy that we get to think through and follow up a bit more. Let me share my screen. And so I'm going to touch on a few of the things that Amy mentioned, but really focus on a particular project, which I'm really happy has made some progress despite everybody's busy schedules. This is a project that I think eventually will be able to start to answer the questions that Amy was asking about and that the community was asking about a few years ago. We, as a team, are looking at the short and long-term effects on population change resulting from hurricane exposure, but we also have a number of other kinds of natural disasters, and it's a collaborative effort across with colleagues at Brown and Minnesota and here at UW. I'm just going to one of the things that motivated us on this project was a 2016 paper by Carlton and Shang, which is a really important paper, and I recommend it to everyone in science. But one of the pieces in the paper, one of the quotes in the paper that really caught my craw was, an assumption that populations aren't changing. And I wanted to take a look at that and think about that a little further with the data that we had been starting to pull together. Our motives, my colleagues I've listed here, but one of our motivations came from Beth Fussel's work out of, as a result of the Katrina hurricane and the pattern of population loss and return following Katrina in New Orleans. And this sort of was one of our animating images and wondering about population dynamics in particular. We were asking 3 questions, and they're based on what we argue are some studies to date that have showed mixed results. And one of them, the one limitation is that for the most part, there hasn't been enough temporal and spatial breadth to capture heterogeneity in population dynamics, and that it's been challenging to have analytic approaches that can address sort of a myriad of confounding factors. So this project is really quite basic, but we asked 3 questions. How do climate-related events impact population dynamics in the short and long term? How do underlying population dynamics condition such effects? And how does a history of exposure to climate-related weather events condition such effects? We harmonize a set of county data from 1970 to 2017. And we have annualized county population size from the US Census. We've developed a measure of economic growth based on an industrial employment growth model called the Bartik measure. And we integrate data from the spatial hazards and spatial hazard events loss database from the US And in particular, we're looking at hurricane data, hurricane events. And what you see on the right here in our graph is the cumulative number of hurricanes between 1970 and 2017 as they've been noted and observed in the Sheldis data. In addition, the Sheldis data asks about, and this is a prospective study of US county level exposure to hurricanes and subsequent population change. And we're interested both in just general exposure to a hurricane as well as exposure to costly hurricanes. So the Sheldis data includes the cost associated with a particular natural disaster event, and that is what's shown here on the right. So getting back to this question, do hurricane effects on population change depend on population momentum and the possibility that there might be some sort of underlying population dynamic? One of the things that we look at is the extent to which hurricane effects differ between shrinking counties versus stable or growing counties. The other thing that we, also stemming from the Carlton and Shang paper, is the idea that the more a place is exposed to hurricanes, the more they may adapt, and the lower the impact of the hurricane on that particular place. Which is perhaps running and operating in the background, with regards to the question that Amy was asking earlier about climate-related migration. So what we do here in this picture, snapshot from the Carlton and Shang paper is showing that the more, this is each of the lines indicates the distribution of exposure to hurricanes. So the first quintile are a set of countries with the fewest exposures to cyclones, and the third, fourth, and fifth would be the highest exposure to cyclones. And what they're showing here is that actually the impact of on the economy as a result of exposure to hurricanes from years since the exposure is lowest amongst those places that are the most exposed. So those places that are most exposed to hurricanes seem to adjust and do okay afterwards. One of the things I wanted to just quickly show you is that for the most part, as you can see here, we show sort of annual distribution of hurricanes across counties in the United States. There's a notable increase in the number and growing heterogeneity and exposure. In our models, I just want to mention that we control for the density, population density and population size in our models, as well as this measure of economic growth. And we adjust in our model, we adjust for county level clustering. A few other things I wanted to just generally show to you that in general, for most counties in the US, most counties are on average, the compound annual growth rate of counties is on the decline. So most counties are experiencing declines in growth over this period of time. In addition, our model, this is our picture of economic growth, and you see some obvious patterns associated with the Great Recession right before 2010 and the early 70s bounces around economic growth and recession. What we do is a difference in difference approach where our analytic sample is those counties between 1990 and 2012. And we're looking at the exposure, whatever is happening prior to 1990 in those counties, and then subsequent post-2012 events or changes in population size, et cetera, after 2012. And the observational sample, therefore, is a 1970 to 2017. So we have a 20-year lagged population variable, and we are looking 5 years forward on our population event, and we're looking at the percent change in population. First of all, everybody has in their head the idea that Katrina is going to be an outlier. And so I'll show you results that include and exclude Katrina effects in our model. But it is true that Katrina had some very large effects in the data set. And so we can talk about that again. But our effects hold whether or not you include Katrina. So how does hurricane exposure affect population change in the first year and for the next, the next 20 years forward? So for all counties, exposure to a hurricane 1 year after yields a 0.1% population reduction from the baseline trajectory. And after 10 years, you actually see a decline of 0.15% after 10 years. If you, instead of using just exposure to a hurricane, if you look at the, this is without Katrina affected county years. So a little bit, slower reduction, a 0.05% reduction, but in general, but once we get rid of Katrina, we actually have we actually have a long-term trend of 0.35% population reduction. If we look at the cost of hurricanes, shows that, sorry, I'm checking my time. We see a real, for every $1,000 loss per capita, we see a 0.15% reduction and a 0.75% population reduction from the baseline 10 years after. So since I'm almost out of time, I wanted to show you the examples of counties where the counties, we split our models and we look just at counties with negative growth versus those with non-negative growth, that is sort of stable or growing. The non-negative growth counties are in green, and the negative growth counties are in red. And what you can see here is that for the most part, the effect of hurricanes, it impacts most the negative, the already declining counties. So it probably accelerates the decline in those counties' populations. You see a slightly less distinctive difference if we look at the impact vis-a-vis the cost of a hurricane. So that in terms of the difference between negative, already declining counties versus stable or growing counties. And then the final thing is, and what does it look like if a county is variously exposed to a number of hurricane events? And here I'll just quickly say that what we see is somewhat similar to what Carlton and Shang find, and that is that if you're less exposed to a hurricane, you have a greater effect on your long-term population trajectory than if you've had more years of more exposure to hurricanes. That's it. And there are lots of good things. We have lots to do. We have many things that we want to do with these data once we get it all harmonized, including looking at, including forecasted data. There. Stop sharing.
Lovely. Thank you, Sarah. So I'm sure, yeah, lots of thoughts about that. I'm sure people have lots of questions and things they'd like to chat about. So if you're one of those people, start putting it in the chat, not in the chat, in the Q&A, so that we can come to those questions after the other presentations. So I'm going to turn to Natalie Williams. Dr. Williams is Associate Professor of Sociology and International Studies. Her research is also focusing on migration and other demographic behavioral responses to climate change, armed conflict, and Zoom just stole my screen, and social change in general. And she's going to talk about some of her research on weather shocks and migration in Nepal. Take it away.
You're on mute.
Okay, here we go. Better? Okay, thank
Great.
you. So, Amy, I wish I could give you answers to whenever you have your next meeting with your group about what's going to happen around here. I can't give you answers, as everybody here knows, I'm sure, but what I want to do today is give you some things to think about. So these are things to think about if you are studying migration in Nepal, which probably most of you are not. But there are also things we can think about studying migration in other poor countries, in addition to studying migration and climate change in the United States and wealthier countries. So I'm just going to input some heuristic tools in your brain is my goal today.
You're on mute again, Natalie.
Okay, how about now? I don't know how that happened. There's all this public talk about climate migration, and there's this idea, we see these pictures like this one being in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's these dry parched ground, and they say, oh, are we going to have climate refugees? Yes, oh my gosh, there's going to be 200 million of them, and and it's clear when you look at pictures like this that of course we're going to have all these climate refugees floating around the world by next year. But when you look at the research, like good, solid, well-designed research on climate and migration, we find actually varying results. Some studies show, yes, there's a positive effect of climate problems on migration. There's some studies that actually show there's a negative effect, like people migrate less in certain settings when there's a weather shock, and then there's some that don't find any effects at all. In addition, even those that find positive effects, they're much weaker than it's expected. Like nobody in the scientific community is saying that we're going to have these 200 million or even 50 million climate refugees. So the question now that we're seeking to answer is like, well, what's going on? Why? It's clear that this should be expected. Look at that parched ground. Why is this not happening? So one of the tools I want to talk about today, just to be clear, I'm focusing on rural agricultural areas and mostly outside the United States, but the thinking tools I'm going to give to you could apply within the US as well. I'm going to engage in a new old theoretical perspective from Ansley Cole. This is a Ready, Willing, and Able. And I want to examine different outcomes of migration, not just that migration is one thing, but there's lots of different types of migration, and they're almost separate types of behavior. So let's start with an old theoretical perspective. We talk in migration about pushes and pulls and costs of journeys a lot. And if you look at migration during climate change from a push perspective, you could come up with this, well, there's bad weather, you lose money on your harvest, so you have to migrate to get remittances for income regeneration. Alternately, you could come up with exactly this opposite prediction, a keep perspective being like an anti-push, right? You have bad weather, so you have less money from your harvest, so you can't migrate because you need to stay home to do increased labor on the farm. Another way you could look at it is a cost perspective. So bad weather means you have less money, and then you have less money to fund your migration, so you'll find less migration. So we have all these theoretical perspectives. There's empirical support for all of these in the literature, but they come up with exactly opposite predictions. And so one of the questions is, what do we do with this? It's not very useful. Another question is, well, if I have this one setting, like I work in Nepal, which one of these is going to be operative? That's what a lot of people look for. Which one's going to be operative? And there's no answer to that because they all make a lot of face, they all have a lot of face validity. So what I want to bring in is the Ready, Willing, and Able. This came from Ansley Cole in 1973, who used it to understand fertility in Europe. A lot of people have heard of this, but it's kind of gone out of use. And I think that's very unfortunate because it's an incredibly helpful tool to think about migration. And I also think about other demographic behaviors as well. And here's the deal. It's not a different theory than the ones I propose above, or the neoclassical economics or new economics of labor migration that we talk about all the time. What this allows us to do is think through the question, well, so which is it? How do all these theories work together? And the deal with RWAs, it's a joint conditional model. So Cole tells us that if we expect a behavioral adaptation like migration, it requires that someone must be ready and they must be willing and they must be able to do that. So you have to have the joint, all these conditions jointly met. And by readiness, he means your motivation or utility or what you stand to gain from the behavior. Willingness is the normative or moral acceptability. I won't talk much about that for the rest of this talk because migration, and there's a normative and moral inacceptability of women migrating in some places, but other than that, it's usually morally acceptable behavior. The third one is able, and that's if you have the financial, social, and human capital to be able to do it. So do you have the money for the bus fare? Can you get on the airplane? Can you get a passport? And so on. So what we can do with RWA is you could say all these push and keep and cast and neoclassical perspectives, it could be all of these. They all make a lot of sense. They all could be operating. And when you look through these different perspectives, you can organize them under, well, this one really speaks to readiness, this one really speaks to ability, and so on. So the push and keep perspectives that I gave you, those are, well, the bad weather makes you more or less ready to migrate. It alters the motivation or utility, whereas the cost perspective alters the ability condition. So in the terms of this scenario here, the ability condition is not met with bad weather. Therefore, it doesn't matter what happens with the push or keep perspective. Even if you're more motivated to leave, if you don't meet the able condition, then you're not going to migrate. So the other tool I want to propose is that migration is just not just a thing. We often think of, even if we don't intend to, our brains often think of migration as, you know, Europeans getting on boats and going across the ocean to the early United States and never to leave again. And we often think about permanent migration, but that is not the case for most migrants in the world today. They intend to leave. They do go home at much larger percentages than they stay anywhere. So I want to separate into long distance and long-term migration. And in this case, in the top left here, these are Nepali migrants working on the soccer stadium in Qatar for the World Cup. It requires a lot more financial capital and a lot more planning to do this type of migration. You have to get passports and visas, you have to pay for airfare. So there's a much higher ability threshold in the RWA parlance to undertake long distance and long-term migration. However, much better remuneration. These workers in Qatar are making a lot more money than the people in the bottom picture who are planting rice in nearby India. But those people in nearby India, the short-term, short-distance migrants, requires almost no planning, very little money. So the ability threshold is much lower and able to get this, to undertake this type of migration. You alternately have lower remuneration. So you do get some money from this, but it doesn't cost as much money to be able to do it. So we examined these different tools and how useful they might be in the case of rural Nepal. On the left here, the picture on the top, that's a house in Chitwan of a migrant worker who went to Qatar, one of those stadium builders. And the bottom is someone who went to India. And you can see the differences. The house on the top is really nice. The house on the bottom, this looks better than a non-migrant's house. They have a toilet that's outside. They have a motorcycle. At one point, they had some money for paint for their house. So they got some out of that, but they didn't get as much, obviously, as the Qatar migrant. So to do this analysis, we used classic event history models, and we measured climate change as the weather shocks that they were exposed to. So we looked over the past 2 years and we counted up the number of months that were abnormal, had more than the normal rain, less than the normal rain, higher heat, and lower heat. And our outcomes for migration, we had short close. You went for less than 1 year and you went to the local area. Long close is long term, but the close, and short far and long far. So here's what happens. It turns out that in a situation where you have 4 outcomes and 4 different weather variables, you kind of need, and in multiple different theoretical perspectives, you need this RWA, because right here you instantly have 16 numbers, and is there a pattern of what's going on here is really hard to figure out. So I'll help you through it. If you look at the bottom rows of temperature shocks, we see that more short-term migration and less long-term migration. So it's not here, the question here isn't, is there more migration in general or less migration? Because there's not. The key here is that people are switching what kind of migrations they use. They're switching from long-term and long distance to short-term and short distance. And that makes sense because when you have temperature shocks, there's crop and animal losses. These cannot be mitigated. When it's too hot, there's nothing you can do about it and your chickens just die. So there's increased readiness because people need income generation or income regeneration from remittances, but there's decreased ability. And so when you have the decreased ability, it appears that people are below that ability threshold to be able to migrate to longer distance places. Interesting, with rainfall shocks, it's a little different. We actually find less short-term migration. Now, this actually makes sense. Even though when there's dry and wet conditions, there's crop losses in the area, but the issue here is it can be mitigated by labor inputs. People can pump water into their fields. They can break the bunds, what do you call them? We call them the bunds. The edges of the field to let water out. They can put water out and in, and that requires a lot of human labor. So in this sense, there's a decreased readiness because your labor is needed at home. There's also an increased readiness because you want to make up for the income that you lost, but ultimately there's a decreased ability. So in the case where the motivation might be about the same, the readiness doesn't change much, but the ability does change overall. We end up seeing less short-term migration. So moving forward in the sense of CSDE's words here, advancing population science, what do we learn from this? These two key tools is that migration is not just one behavior. You migrate or not isn't really how it works. Different kinds of migration have very different connections to climate change. They mean very different things. In essence, they're almost different theoretical behaviors. And then the second thing is I really want to propose this ready, willing, and able, this joint model that helps us make sense of multiple theoretical connections and multiple outcomes that we're looking at the same time. And that's what I have for you today.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That was, we are complexifying as we go, which is always good because it's always kind of amazing how, I don't know, I find that ready, willing, and able like such a nice way to bundle things in this in an intellectual framework that makes sense when they didn't make any sense at all when they're looked at independently. But we got to complexify to be able to then organize, I think. So we have gone from impacts, thinking about migration within the US due to hurricanes, so domestic, and we've looked at impacts in Nepal, and also how to think about these things. Long, far, long, close, far, close, short, long, there. And now, I don't know, he's going to bring it all home, Jeremy Hess. So Dr. Hess is an emergency medicine physician who is also trained in global environmental health. And he directs the University of Washington Center for Health and the Global Environment. He's going to be talking about some things that are being talked about, thought about, and written about in terms of climate change and migration in the forthcoming IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, regular reports about climate. Take it away, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So as requested and as billed, I'm going to complexify substantially. I'm going to talk about our nearly complete work on Chapter 7 of the upcoming 6th assessment report. And I want to start out by telling you a little bit about the IPCC. Most of you probably are familiar with it, but figure it's helpful to give a little bit of background. The IPCC is a UN organization. It's a joint organization or a partnership between the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program. And the goal of the IPCC is to conduct assessments regarding the state of knowledge related to climate change, and specifically vulnerabilities and consequences of particular shifts in the climate over time so that we can avoid, prepare for, and respond to these changes. And any government that has signed onto either the UNEP or WMO conventions is part of the IPCC. So it's most governments in the world. And the IPCC produces assessments. These are the most probably famous of these are the assessment reports that happen every 5 to 7 years. And you can see here, this is a list of all the different activities the IPCC has taken on and the reports they've done. So the assessments are the big reports. Then they also have smaller, more focused special reports that are requested by member countries and focus on specific questions. And my first engagement with the IPCC was with a report called the SREX, which was the special report on climate change risks and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. I'm probably mangling the title. It was a little bit forced, but it was about disasters and adaptation, and it was a combined effort between Working Group 1, which focuses on physical impacts and modeling climate change, and Working Group 2, which focuses on impacts and adaptation. And for me, it was a formative experience. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions. So this report is the 6th assessment report, and we are working on chapter 7, which is a new combined effort in Working Group 2. It's the first time that human health and human security have been combined. And the title of the chapter is Health, Wellbeing, and the Changing Structure of Communities. And that changing structure of communities refers not least to migration and its impacts on all these other issues, including population health. And in doing this, the IPCC, I think, is moving in the right direction, asking the right questions, but we have found it has gotten substantially ahead of where the literature is. And the IPCC is not a research organization. The IPCC focuses on existing literature, which is why it always has somewhat of a conservative bent intellectually. It only assesses what's already known, not what we think we know or what is even that cutting edge. And in this case, as you'll see, we've struggled to synthesize all this into one compelling message. A little more background about how in the IPCC, people think about risk. It's a dynamic process that includes changes in hazards. So you heard about several different hazards already from the other panelists related to hurricanes, droughts, flooding, etc. All of those are shifting as a result of climate change. There are several other physical hazards that are important to think about in terms of livelihoods and everything else. Then there's vulnerability. And here you can think about population factors that both increase exposure to these hazards and also confer protection against these hazards. And then exposure is actually the population at risk. So it's an important, migration is an important driver of exposure potentially, because not only do migrants probably have a different profile in terms of their vulnerability, but it's just moving people from one place to another and therefore changing the hazard exposure profile for these different communities. And all of these are dynamic. They all feed back into one another. So socioeconomic development interacts with climate and risk and changes development trajectories of communities over time. And this all affects determinants of health, which is another overarching concept that I want to introduce here. The key point of which is that a population's health is only partially determined by its access to healthcare and some of the things that we tend to think of as important for population health. And about 40% of a population's health, or variability in a population's health, is really ultimately based on variability around economic and social opportunities and resources. And this, of course, affects living and working conditions, and then access to medical care and other personal behaviors. But socioeconomic development is a key determinant of population health, and migration is a key element of socioeconomic development in the face of all of these worsening hazards. this is a diagram that shows you how living conditions and socioeconomic development feed into health. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but highlights the mechanisms and the flows. And each of these is going to vary substantially based on the population and the hazard and other things that you're thinking about. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of connectivity between inequity and social structures that impact health downstream. And over time, you can see really substantial trends that link these different factors. So you can see demographic transitions that occur over time with socioeconomic development, where in this image on the left here, you can see that in 1950, a population pyramid was heavily weighted toward individuals in the very young individuals, but as a population grows and becomes wealthier, the population pyramid bows out, and so people survive much longer, and you have a corresponding risk transition in terms of environmental health, where you have you have improvements in household sanitation, and that leads to improvements in infectious disease rates. But you have increases in urban pollution, which start to cause some of the chronic diseases that we're familiar with. You also have, as you get far up the wealth trajectory spectrum dimension, you see substantial increases in energy utilization and emissions of greenhouse gases. And this plays into migration at higher ends of the wealth spectrum. You see much more in migration. But overall, when we look at migration generally, and this is a slide from Robert McClellan, who I think was at the Portland conference that you all were referencing, you see these main take-home patterns. Most migration in response to environmental factors takes place within countries. If it's international, it's usually to local or to nearby countries. It's particularly among people who are mobile and able in the framing that was presented before. And it usually relies on existing well-worn pathways and networks. It's also mostly rural to urban. And migrants have a lot of challenges with health. They're actually generally a younger, healthier population. So their underlying health status is good, but they often face barriers to accessing health. And so the context that they move into in terms of determinants of health can be much more challenging than the context they left in terms of ability to access services and other things, though their socioeconomic circumstances may be improved. And one of the concerns with climate change is that we'll see such strain on some of our systems that we'll see widespread economic collapse in certain locations. And some of you may be familiar with this book. It's really long read, but very interesting. And Jared Diamond outlines 5 factors that are important for predisposing a society to collapse. And one of those is climate change, but others include hostile relationships between neighboring countries and collapse of trading relationships between neighboring partners, environmental problems, and then failures to adapt and think creatively to those challenges. And we see this play out in Syria, where we could spend a whole session talking about this in particular, but we had long-term environmental changes, droughts, and rise in water-fed irrigation, and increasing strain on that whole system from the drought. You had population growth. You had, of course, a political regime that was unfriendly and lost connections with its neighbors. And as a result, we had a war and large attempted migration, well, actual and attempted migration, and substantial dramatic impacts on population health for these communities. One of the things that we have observed in the 6th assessment, in the literature available to us when we're doing our literature review for our chapter, is that there's a now pretty well-established paradigm that there's quite a bit of climate sensitive disease in the world. It's well over 50% of the global burden of disease, but it's not equally distributed, obviously. And it's difficult to say exactly how this this burden may shift over time. We can see that for diseases that have a very direct relationship in terms of environmental hazard exposure and health impacts, that we will see substantial and worrisome impacts on human health, but they probably won't rise in many cases to a catastrophic level. But when you think about indirect risks and risk to those larger social determinants of health and and government's abilities to provide adequate health protections, then we may well see some catastrophic risks. And migration and instability related to both sending and receiving communities is a substantial part of that dynamic, at least theoretically. We haven't really got enough evidence yet to say whether that will play out. But our paradigms in population health certainly suggest that we will see substantial health impacts as a result of all of these different upstream drivers. And the population health impacts could be quite substantial. If you look at the United States, coming back to some work by Shang and his colleagues, you can see that some of the trends that might portend significant push for internal migration are pretty substantial, actually. We're going to see significant changes in agricultural yields between now and the end of the century. These are projections with high emissions scenarios. We're going to see shifts in mortality, particularly related to heat. We're going to see significant increases in energy expenditures, particularly in the Southeast, and net reductions in the Northwest. We're going to see decreased labor productivity in low risk occupations, particularly again pronounced in the Southeast. And then in high risk labor, so people who are working outside in physically demanding jobs, we'll see universally a decrease in labor productivity, but again, it's most pronounced in the hotter regions of the country. And we're going to see a lot of substantial coastal damages resulting from flooding, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. We'll see increases in property crime in some parts of the country and changes in violent crime as well. And overall, what we see is net damages that are quite substantial in parts of our country and net gains that are not as substantial, but still significant in other parts. So there's likely to be significant motivation for internal migration. Whether that will happen and exactly how remains to be seen, because a lot of what we're talking about now is actually unprecedented. And so these potential exposures, it's going to be difficult to answer some of these questions using just historical experience. So in summary, the world's recognizing these intersections and expressed concerns about them, but we don't really have all the information that we need to answer these questions. We're still incorporating what we know, and we have some unprecedented dynamics ahead. Clearly, climate change affects health through direct and indirect mechanisms. And changes in the population structure are really important to consider, but so far have really not been integrated into global assessments around these issues. We know climate change is going to drive migration, but we don't know exactly where, how, and what that will do to risks of conflict. And we know that there is a potential in certain contexts for the creation of pretty substantial complex humanitarian emergencies. But for more routine migration, we also know that there's a lot that can be done to preserve people's health and make sure they have sustained access to important determinants of health and are able to stay healthy when they arrive. So thanks. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, everybody, Sarah and Natalie as well. And so our invisible audience members, we can feel you, but we can't see you. So make your presence known by putting some questions in the Q&A. And we do have one already for Natalie I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Tiago. Tiago?
Yeah, hey.
Go
Cool,
ahead.
yeah, that's fine. Well, it's kind of a selfish question, but I really enjoyed seeing the coal theory applied to this. And so I'm just wondering, given that I use like census count or population estimates in like the EPLUMS data set for Brazil. I was just curious to know if there's any sort of like, I don't know, innovative way I can apply this, or just in a lot of ways, I really am always like impressed with the data collection efforts and the data sets that come out of migration, climate change, migration, and those kinds of studies. So I was just curious to know if maybe Natalie and then other folks as well can talk more about like the data and how, you know, I don't know, maybe we can apply different theories to old data sets, but yeah, just that selfish question, but hopefully it can be brought into other folks.
So there's two different ways to use the RWA as I see it. One is a heuristic tool. So that's how we use it. I'm not using it as a theory that you can test. I'm using that as a thinking tool to put together other theories to derive how we understand what's going on. So there's no test in my paper of RWA. The test is that, is it useful for us to figure out what's going on? And the answer is yes. In this case, it was very useful for us as a tool. As far as testing the theory, you can look up Listagi and Vanderhaft, and there's another Listagi and Surkine have written papers that are more using it as a theory that you can test. So like if you can measure readiness over, over some space, and you can measure ability, then is there a point at which there's a joint conditional, the joint conditions are met and the behavior happens, or below that point, how does changing one of these, like the idea would be like if you change readiness but ability is not high enough, then the outcome wouldn't change. And if you change the ability but readiness is still below the threshold, then the outcome wouldn't change. So if you can think of a way to measure readiness and willingness and ability, which is ostensibly totally possible, and you can think of a way to measure thresholds, put the thresholds in there, you could test this as a theory of like, does this work as a theory or not? So those are two different ways to use it. I have a lot to say about migration data, but since I've already answered one piece of this, I'll see if my co-panelists want to jump in about migration data.
I don't know if we would have the same thing to say, but I, the migration theory is really pretty far ahead of migration data. I mean, the way we think about how migration works and how we conceptualize it is pretty outpaced where what we have in terms of data. And it's very hard to obviously collect, I mean, ideally prospective data. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Nepal data is that it does allow you to do some of that work. That's what I would say. Yeah, sometimes it's good. Sometimes those household surveys are helpful, but they do have some limitations.
One of the problems with migration data is that when you want a retrospective sample of an area, migrants are the people that are precisely not in the area that you're studying. Like they're everywhere else in the world besides that. And so if you really want to do a thorough migration study, you need, like Sarah said, a prospective study. But even then, there's a lot of prospective studies around the world. There's a network of health and demographic surveillance studies. And I'd be happy to list off some good prospective migration data collections if anybody's interested. But even then, one of the problems is a lot of them go back to the area they're studying once a year. And so like, were you here last year? Are you here now? And they're not catching the short-term migration that happens that's less than a year. And as I showed you in my study, like it really matters. Short-term migration is most migrants move in this world on a short-term basis. And if you don't catch them at all, you have no idea what's actually going on. And because the difference between short-term migration and long-term migration, they're actually very different behaviors. If you don't have like a short-term and prospective data collection, you're not going to catch those, and you're missing like a lot of what's going on. I didn't mean to be a downer there.
Cool, thank you so much. That was really great. I appreciate the heuristic aspect of it. Is something that I constantly always miss, right? Just always trying to test everything, but I think that was really informative.
I think Henry Noble says he doesn't have a microphone, so we have
right. And he's curious if Jeremy, if your slides of the U.S. effects of climate change would be accessible to UW students or could be made accessible to UW students.
Yes, I can make the slides accessible to you the
Just a quick interrupt, but we do record this. So if somebody wants to look at this later, there is a recording of the entire presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd also encourage you to access the paper, the Shang et al. Paper that I referred to, where I pulled those images from, because that'll give you a lot more context. And that's, of course, available through the libraries.
So I'm assuming you guys try to be sticklers for time, and we're coming up on the end here. But there aren't any other open questions, so I was going to ask one for you, which I know we don't really have enough time to address. But I find I was struck by what Natalie said about, and others had similar comments. Like, we have these things in our head, or lots of people have opinions or strong fears or thoughts about what's going to happen with climate change and migration. And Natalie's looking at the literature and seeing different signals. Jeremy's trying to write a chapter, finding the questions maybe ahead of the answers. And yet what I find when I talk to folks about this is they don't really have any patience for any studies that say maybe it's not as big as you think, or there's all these questions. They just say climate change is going to upend everything and we don't have any idea, and so we should be really worried about this. And of course, this is a common challenge in climate change work, right? Is that the past is not indicative of the future. And so I'm just curious, I'd just love to hear each of you a couple minutes on your thoughts about how we handle this sort of non-stationarity of cause and moving forward in this. What are your thoughts about addressing the kinds of questions you're addressing in a world that doesn't look like the past?
I have a quick response, but I don't want to take too much time. But this is one of the reasons why we set up the study that we did, the study design that we did, but it's still not enough yet. But the point being that I think that what we're trying to get at is how big of an effect, how quickly, how soon, when is it going to happen, and what are the intermediating kind of factors that might influence that rate of change and upendedness. But in the context of the United States, one of the things that we know is that there are the places that might be most at risk, say, of hurricane damages, are also places that are growing in population, that have a lot of sunk costs, that the characteristics of place and people's relationship to place hasn't really quite been completely understood. And I think it's partially captured in Natalie's idea around willingness, ability, readiness, but how people who in my Thailand work, what we know is that people really are attached to their place. They're not going to go and leave it forever unless it's really disastrous and terrible. In the case of the hurricanes, there's a lot of sunk costs that states and counties and everybody sort of reinvests back into those places. We have policies that sort of keep people also tied to place. So I think that's a key component here that we haven't completely made sense of, the relationship of individuals, communities to that place that they've invested in, that others have invested in, et cetera.
I think about these long-term studies as narratives. I don't credit them with a lot of precision. I hope that they're generally valid, and I hope they can inform our decision making. But my perception is that most of the things that I focus on in my work are already relatively poorly managed risks. And so the challenge is actually finding the way to manage these risks more effectively currently, and identifying the most important principles for effectively and equitably managing these risks, and then leaning really heavily into those principles as we move forward, because there's tremendous uncertainty, and climate is just one piece of a very uncertain future.
So what I'd add to that, those are both really interesting thoughts. What I'd add to that is a lot of the work on climate change that says, well, it's not as big, it's not as big of an effect as we thought there would be. Partially that's because we've studied what's happened in the past, and climate we think is going to change more dramatically than it's been in the past. So the floods we've had in the past, there are going to be bigger floods in the future, and there's going to be bigger hurricanes, and there's going to be bigger droughts, is what they're telling us. Now we can say, okay, I can put in my model if there's a bigger drought and look if there's going to be behavioral changes and say, well, there was not that many behavioral changes. But one of the problems is that if I'm following the behavioral regime of the past, that would be the case, but we don't know if the future climate changes are going to be so large that they would overwhelm the existing adaptive capacity of places. Because people already know how to adapt to climate changes. Humans have been dealing with climate change throughout human history, and there's a lot of adaptations, and that's why we haven't seen a lot of changes in the past, because they already know how to deal with it. But if climate differences or climate changes overwhelm existing adaptive capacity, it could be totally different. And in that sense, what we can do is we can use computational simulation models to just make things up. Oh, if it changes like in this crazy way, what would happen? If it changes in this totally other crazy way, what would happen? And we'd have no idea if any of those crazy ways could come true, but we might have a range of possibilities if they happen. And another response I would give to that question is, oh, why is it not as big as we think? Isn't it going to be as big as we think? Another thing I would throw back a question is, maybe it's different than what you think. What we expect, we just expect people to get up and leave. Maybe they're doing different things. Maybe they're shortening or lengthening the type of migration or the place that they go, or maybe they're making other adaptations in their behaviors, and we're just not looking at the right outcome.
Thank you. This is so hard to end. This is so great. But, I think that somebody told me once that I think when I was trying to teach, and I was so frustrated because I'd get to the end of class and there'd be a discussion going that I'd have to cut off. And they're like, but that's good, because it means you had all these things to talk about and people were super engaged and interested. So we just had a lot of food for thought and a lot of good good things to think about, to both complexify, I think, but also to maybe not simplify, but give ourselves some frameworks for thinking about how we might understand the world around us, think about what's going to happen in the future, and also deal with living in a world where we can't actually know all the future. So we have to manage thoughtfully. So thanks,
Thanks,
Sarah,
Thank you,
Natalie, Jeremy.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you all.
And
Wonderful.
thank you all the team, Maria and everybody, for helping, and thank you everybody for attending.